A desperate queen, a barren womb, and a theft that defies the gods. To save her crown, Queen Zenebe steals a commoner's infant from a sacred shrine, passing him off as the royal heir. But as Prince Kolawole grows, the palace silk cannot hide his true nature. With every strike of the hammer in the royal forge, the boy's resemblance to the lowly blacksmith becomes a scandal that threatens to topple a dynasty. Blood will out, and the ancestors are watching. One throne. Two fathers. A life forged in fire. Before we continue, please like, share, and subscribe. The moon hung like a silver-curved blade over the kingdom of Oregon, casting long, jagged shadows across the sacred grove. Queen Zenebe, draped in heavy silks that felt like lead against her skin, knelt before the ancient shrine of the Great Mother. For 7 years, her womb had been a dry well, a silent cavern that refused to echo with the cry of a prince. The king's younger wives were already blooming like hibiscus after a rain, their sons growing tall and strong. Zenebe knew that if she did not produce an heir by the next great harvest, she would be cast out to the outskirts of the city, forgotten and shamed. As she wept into the dust, a faint, rhythmic wailing pierced the night. Near the foot of the ancestor stones lay a bundle wrapped in coarse, unbleached cotton, the mark of a commoner. It was a tradition for those who could not afford to feed their young to leave them at the shrine, hoping the gods or a traveling merchant might take pity. Zenebe approached the bundle, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The infant was robust, with skin the color of polished mahogany and a birthmark shaped like a lightning bolt on his shoulder. Without a prayer or a backward glance, she scooped the child into her royal robes, extinguishing the shrine's eternal flame as she fled, leaving the gods in darkness. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, the palace was filled with the sounds of simulated labor and the orchestrated chaos of the queen's handmaidens. Zenebe lay on her gilded mat, sweat pouring from her brow, as she presented the miracle to King Adebayo. The king, blinded by a desperate need for a successor, raised the child toward the rafters, declaring him Prince Kolawole, the future Lion of Oregon. But as the queen watched the king rejoice, she noticed the child's grip. Even as an infant, his hands were strangely calloused, and he did not smell of the royal incense, but of the scorched earth and cold iron. 17 reigns had passed since the night of the theft, and Prince Kolawole had grown into a youth of formidable strength. While his half-brothers spent their afternoons reciting poetry or learning the delicate art of courtly diplomacy, Kolawole was drawn to the heat of the lower courtyards. He possessed a chest as broad as a baobab trunk and arms that seemed carved from dark basalt. Queen Zenebe watched from her high balcony, her heart tightening with every passing season. She had draped her son in the finest Kent cloths and adorned his neck with heavy coral beads, yet nothing could mask the raw, terrestrial power that radiated from him, a power that did not mirror the lean, willow-like grace of King Adebayo. The whispers began in the market stalls and drifted like smoke into the palace corridors. It was not just the prince's strength that unsettled the court, but his uncanny resemblance to Jengo, the royal blacksmith. Jengo was a man of silent labor, his skin permanently dusted with soot and his muscles forged by decades of striking iron. When Kolawole walked past the forge, the rhythmic clink-clank of Jengo's hammer would falter. The two men would exchange a glance, one of youthful curiosity and the other of haunted recognition. They shared the same heavy brow, the same square jawline, and most damningly, the same lightning bolt birthmark etched into their left shoulders, visible whenever the heat of the forge forced them to strip to the waist. King Adebayo, once blinded by pride, began to feel the cold prickle of doubt. During the festival of New Yams, as Kolawole wrestled the strongest warriors to the dust with ease, the king noticed the elders leaning in to whisper. They pointed not at the royal dais, but toward the forge where Jengo stood watching. The king looked from his son to the blacksmith, seeing a reflection that no royal bloodline could explain. Zenebe, sensing the shifting winds, clutched her fan so tightly the ivory snapped. She realized that while she had stolen a child to secure her throne, she had accidentally invited the living evidence of her treason to grow up under the king's very nose. The iron was heating, and the scent of scandal was beginning to burn. The unsettling resemblances grew too glaring to ignore, even for King Adebayo. The whispers of the court, once distant hums, now buzzed like angry bees around his throne. He began to observe Kolawole and Jengo with a keen, almost obsessive intensity. During the morning court, he would subtly position himself to catch both the prince and the blacksmith in his line of sight, scrutinizing the way they held their heads, the deep-set gaze in their eyes, the very angle of their shoulders. The undeniable truth began to form a cold knot in his stomach. The prince, his supposed heir, carried the unmistakable mark of the forge, not the palace. One sweltering afternoon, the king summoned Jengo to his private chambers, a rare and intimidating honor. Jengo, clad in his customary leather apron and smelling faintly of charcoal and metal, knelt before the king. Adebayo did not speak immediately. Instead, he walked around the kneeling man, circling him like a predator. "Jengo," the king finally said, his voice dangerously soft, "I have observed your diligence for many years. You are a loyal servant, and your craft is unmatched. Tell me, old friend, do you have any living relatives? A brother, perhaps, who shares your striking features?" Jengo, bewildered and wary, confirmed that he was an only child, his parents having perished during the Great Famine decades ago. "And a child, Jengo? Have you, perhaps, fathered a child in the villages beyond Oregon, one who might bear your image?" The blacksmith's face remained impassive, hardened by years of disciplined labor. He had no children, he stated, his voice a low rumble. Yet, as he spoke, his eyes flickered, betraying a deep, unresolved sorrow. The king dismissed him, but the seed of suspicion had taken root, watered by Jengo's subtle anguish. Adebayo knew in his heart that a terrible deception had been played upon him, and the architect of that deceit could only be one person. The atmosphere within the palace grew thick and suffocating, like the air before a great tropical storm. Queen Zenebe, sensing the king's growing coldness, retreated into the shadows of her chambers, her mind a frantic loom weaving desperate lies. She knew the king had summoned Jengo, and she knew the elders were consulting the oracle bones. To protect her secret, she summoned the royal midwife, the only living witness to the night of the miracle birth. Under the flickering light of an oil lamp, Zenebe offered the old woman a pouch of gold and a sharp warning: "The boy is the king's blood, or your blood will water the thirsty soil by dawn." However, the truth had a way of bleeding through even the thickest veils. King Adebayo, driven by a restless spirit, made a pilgrimage back to the ancestral shrine where Kolawole had allegedly been born under the stars. There, among the moss-covered stones and the scent of ancient libations, he found a forgotten relic, a small, weathered pendant of iron, the specific mark of the blacksmith's guild, tangled in the roots of a sacred iroko tree. It was the same pendant Jengo had once worn as a young apprentice, a token he had reportedly lost the very night his infant son was stolen by the spirits during a desperate offering for the child's health. The king returned to the palace not with a scepter, but with a silent, terrifying clarity. He did not confront Zenebe immediately. Instead, he ordered a grand feast, inviting every noble, every elder, and, most pointedly, Jengo the Blacksmith. As the drums began to beat a rhythm that felt like a funeral march, Kolawole stood at the center of the court, bare-chested for the traditional dances. The firelight caught the lightning bolt mark on his shoulder, and as Jengo stepped forward to present a ceremonial sword, the two men stood side by side. The court fell into a deathly silence. The resemblance was no longer a whisper, it was a shout that echoed off the palace walls, demanding a reckoning that could no longer be delayed. The grand feast reached a staggering crescendo as King Adebayo rose from his throne, his golden staff striking the stone floor with the force of a falling tree. The drums died instantly, leaving only the crackle of the hearth fires and the heavy breathing of the gathered crowd. The king walked slowly toward the center of the court, where Prince Kolawole and Jengo the Blacksmith stood like two pillars of the same temple. Without a word, the king pulled back the silk shoulder cloth of the prince and the leather strap of the blacksmith. Under the orange glow of the torches, the twin lightning bolt birthmarks burned clearly for all to see, a divine signature that no human lie could erase. Queen Zenebe fell to her knees, her royal beads clattering against the floor like rain on a tin roof. The silence was broken by her sob, a ragged sound of a woman who had spent 17 years running from the truth. The womb was silent, my king, she cried, her voice echoing off the rafters. I did it for the throne, for the line of Oregon, so that your glory would not fade into a brother's shadow. The king looked down at her, his face a mask of sorrow rather than rage. He realized that his own desperation for an heir had built the very pedestal upon which this deception sat. He turned to Kolawole, whose eyes were wide with the sudden shattering of his identity. In a move that stunned the elders, King Adebayo did not reach for his executioner's blade. Instead, he took the ceremonial sword from Jengo's hands and placed it in Kolawole's. Blood makes a relative, the king declared, his voice booming through the hall, but the spirit makes a son. You were stolen from the shrine, but you were raised by the crown. He decreed that Kolawole would remain a prince, but Jengo would be elevated to the royal council as the prince's true father and mentor. Queen Zenebe was exiled to the silent temple she had once robbed, to spend her days tending the fires she had extinguished. As the sun rose, the boy with the blacksmith's heart and the king's name began his reign, forged in truth and tempered by mercy.